obligation to document the condition of the animals and seek intervention on their behalf. Why would any government not want to ensure the proper treatment of animals in these circumstances? And why would any government want to hide or cover up such conditions from Ontario residents and taxpayers? Under normal circumstances, the government provides us with very little information about the conditions under which farmed animals are forced to live. Occasionally, we get a glimpse into the industry, as happened in the 2-year trial between the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Maple Lodge Farms, where both broiler chickens and spanned hens died in very large numbers during transport to slaughter in inclement weather. And now Ontario is dealing with COVID-19. The virus has exposed vulnerabilities in our society, such as in nursing homes, shelters, homeless folks, workers in slaughterhouses, and migrant workers. What is not being discussed is the fate of animals on farms, stockyards, auction barns during the COVID crisis. How many animals have been impacted by the closure of such facilities? I've not been able to find any ministry reports as to what is happening to the animals in whose slaughter dates have been suspended due to plant closings. Are there situations in Ontario where farmed animals are being killed in large numbers due to the effects of COVID-19? And if so, how are they being killed? How are they being handled on farms? Some headlines in the United States may give us a glimpse, talking about piglets being aborted, chickens being gassed, animals being culled through suffocation, drowning, and shooting, and yes, even ventilation shutdown. The fact that Ontarians currently do not know what is happening in farms is deeply troubling. The intent of Bill 156 is to further suppress information about how farmed animals are forced to live. Please withdraw Bill 156. You will not succeed in keeping the condition of farmed animals a secret. Animals have the right to live their lives free of pain and suffering. They deserve to be considered.
You have 1 minute left.
Yes, they deserve to be considered sentient beings, not production units. Ontario taxpayers have the right to know what happens to animals on farms. COVID-19 has provided us with a very real opportunity to work together to change our approach to farm animals. We have a very real opportunity to move away from industrialized animal agriculture, which we know contributes heavily to the climate crisis we face, and we know that the animals face great deprivation, cruelty, and suffering. My recommendation is let's take this opportunity to redefine the evolution of animal agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. White. I now turn to Andrea Jones-Bitton. Please state your name for the record, and you will have 7 minutes. You may begin.
My name is Dr. Andrea Jones-Bitton. I am a veterinarian, epidemiologist, associate professor and director of wellbeing programming at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. I've been studying farmer mental health for the past 5 years. My team and I have published several articles on the topic of farmer stress, depression, anxiety, burnout, and resilience. This research has involved a national survey of over 1,100 farmers, as well as an analysis of 75 one-on-one research interviews conducted by one of my PhD candidates. I also network regularly with the farming community via conferences, annual general meetings, and research and outreach activities. Farming is reported as one of the world's most stressful occupations. Farmers experience elevated levels of stress, mental illness, and suicide compared to other populations. Despite not specifically asking any question about animal activism, it was raised by some of our research participants in both the national survey and one-on-one interviews. In these instances, there was a strong sense of attack and vilification of farmers. Several farmers shared stories of personal attacks that they and members of their family had experienced. They reported being called things like a rapist, shill, murderer, and baby killer. We've heard stories of farm families experiencing the devastation of a barn fire and having protesters in their laneway calling them murderers while they are dealing with the tragedy. We have heard stories of farmers being goaded and provoked for response. One farmer told us about how his name, photo, and farm location was shared among an animal activist organization's global networks. Participants described the heavy mental load that these acts had, including them being an attack on their personal and entire way of life, their honor, and their personal code of ethics. They've described these stressors as compounding their already significant occupational stress. In some cases, participants described activist excursions and trespassing on their farms. In doing so, they described fear and concern around safety concerns for their families and children who live on the farm. For example, one participant shared, "I have to go around to my guys and say, is your barn locked? Are there any strangers on the property?" and that kind of stuff. And they're pretty conscious. They have families too, right? There's children and there's pets in the yard and that kind of stuff. It is completely reasonable for someone to experience fear and intimidation when strangers, particularly strangers who disagree with your entire way of life, come onto your property where you and your family live and work. Participants also described safety concerns for their animals. For example, one participant shared, "We have to lock our barns now because we're afraid of people coming into our barns and doing things to our animals," right? These participants described fears around people harming and or causing extreme stress to their animals. Biosecurity concerns were also described, being associated with trespassing and people entering the barns, ignoring or not being aware of the serious disease risks that they pose. These participants discussed the biosecurity and food safety risks associated with activists entering their barns or interacting with animals during transport. Finally, participants described a need to now be hypervigilant and constantly on guard, which compounds their already high levels of stress and adds to their occupational stressors. For example, one participant said, "I get jumpy every time someone stops on the road to take a picture of my cows in the field, or an unfamiliar car drives in the laneway. I used to embrace it." Another shared, "It's a whole other level of stress because you never quite know when it's going to happen and you never know what's going to come up and you never even Facebook, it's like, who's going to say something next? I just don't need this. With everything, I just don't need this." All of these issues related to activism and trespassing compounds the significant stress that many of our farmers are already experiencing, which can exacerbate issues with poor mental health. This is a serious issue not only for the mental health of the farmers and their families themselves, but may actually run counter to the goals of animal activists. And this is because poor mental health may contribute to decreased productivity and reduced attention to animal health and welfare. When we are under stress or experiencing poor mental health, it becomes more difficult to perform to usual standards and to take care of ourselves and others, even when that is important to us. Several published articles describe an association between major animal welfare incidents and poor mental health of the farmers that care for the animals. Actions taken that negatively impact farmer mental health could potentially lead to decreased animal welfare. The issue of animal activism, intimidation, and coercion was explored as part of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food study of farmer mental health and was considered important enough to have its own recommendation, number 3, including, quote, "campaigns and strategies to combat the growing incidence of cyberbullying, intimidation, and threats," and, quote, "consider including any form of intimidation or cyberbullying targeted at any group of Canadians based on their occupation or places of residence as a criminal code offense." This reflects the seriousness of the issues.
You have 1 minute left.
To summarize, the issue of animal activism and on-farm trespassing by animal activists was raised by some participants despite not specifically being asked, highlighting the level of concerns that they experience. The on-farm trespassing events were described as a major source of stress due to the fear and risk posed to their farmers, their families, and their animals, the serious risk to biosecurity, and the compounding effect of these events on top of what is already a higher level of occupational occupational stress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Jody Lazar. Could you please state your name for the record, and you may begin.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Jody Lazar. I'm an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie in Halifax. And I'm here today to share with you my expertise in Canadian constitutional law, which I've been teaching at Dalhousie since 2014. I also teach a seminar called Animals and the Law. I've been doing that since 2017. More recently, I've been doing research on the constitutional dimensions of animal rights activism and the question of constitutionally protected speech and the impacts of legislation like Bill 156. And I'm here specifically because I'm concerned that Ontario might be on the verge of adopting a law that would not survive a constitutional challenge. In February, I signed a letter to this effect, along with more than 40 legal experts, and I want to use my time here to flesh out some of the concerns expressed there. So I'm going to focus on two things, which are the two parts to a constitutional analysis, starting with the first question, which is whether the legislation limits charter rights. And here it's pretty clear to me and to others that Bill 156 in its current form does in fact restrict charter freedoms. So specifically Section 4.6, the false pretenses provision, and Section 5 more broadly, the transport provision. So for false pretenses, the difficulty here is that the provision dictates what someone is and is not allowed to say. It targets a particular message, a misrepresentation, and says you cannot say this. And that's a clear violation of freedom of expression. But more significant, perhaps, is the effect of the prohibition, which is, of course, as you've heard several times today, that it limits the ability of undercover journalists, for example, or undercover or whistleblowing employees to share information with the public, to ensure that Canadian consumers understand the consequences of their purchasing choices, and to ensure that the public can make informed choices about what they buy, what they eat, and what they support. So in the United States, where similar laws have been struck down, legislative reforms regarding animal farming and food safety have often resulted from pressure following undercover exposés. And the same is true of dietary choices. Research again in the US, we don't have that research yet in Canada, but to my knowledge, but suggests that the majority of Americans who change their diets to include fewer animal products, they do so as a result of what they learn about commercial farming and about the treatment of farm animals. Now, whether or not we agree with those choices, the fact is that people have a right to the information on which to base them. So the Supreme Court of Canada has been unequivocal about the fact that Section 2B of the Charter, freedom of expression, protects not only the right to speak, but also the right to listen and the right to receive that kind of information that influences those choices. With respect to the transport provision, it seems to me that it's in clear conflict with the Charter right to freedom of peaceful assembly, Section 2C. It's telling people, animal rights activists, members of the Save movement who demonstrate outside of slaughterhouses, that they cannot hold those gatherings. But I would also argue that the provision limits freedom of expression as well. So people who protest outside of slaughterhouses, who approach transport trucks with animals on them, they're carrying out a particular form of expressive activity. It's the act of what they call bearing witness, you heard about this today, to the final moments of the animals' lives, and documenting and sharing what they see with members of the public. And the law, again, here it's telling them, you can't do that. You can't express yourself in this particular way. Last thing I'll say about the limits themselves before I move briefly on to justification, step 2, I just want to highlight the nature of the expression that we're dealing with here. The expression in question here is political activism, it's truth-seeking, it's information sharing, and these are the purposes of freedom of expression. So this is expression on an issue that's deeply meaningful to activists, and it's also a proper subject for public debate. Again, U.S. courts in the cases dealing with similar laws have recognized this. Courses on animal law are now offered in at least half the law schools across the country. I've given public lectures on this subject to full auditoriums. So all that to say that this is a subject that people care about legally and politically. which is why it's what I would characterize as high value speech. And I'm borrowing that phrase from the Supreme Court, which has said multiple times that political speech really lies at the heart of freedom of expression, which is itself one of our most fundamental freedoms. Now, what that means in practical terms is that restrictions on that speech are going to be harder for the government to justify, as justification under the Charter is the government's burden. Now, the justification test is it's a multi-step test. I don't have time to get into all of the steps, but what I will put to you is that the provisions are not rationally connected to the legislative objective. The bill and the accompanying materials, everything we've heard, it's very clear that the objective here is to protect farmer safety, animal safety, and biosecurity, and to prevent the risks associated with people trespassing onto farms. Now, as I understand things, trespassers are not gaining access based on false pretenses, right? They're not posing as employees. They're not undercover investigators or journalists. They're protesters. They don't get permission based on truth or on a misrepresentation before they enter farms, right? They just enter or trespass. The false pretenses provision then seems to be aimed at something else, something more covert, like those who might pose as employees and act as whistleblowers. But there's nothing to suggest
You have 1 minute left.
Thank you. There's nothing to suggest that those are the individuals that threaten biosecurity. They're not the cause of the mischief being targeted, in other words, which means that limiting their speech is not rationally connected to the objective, and that's enough for a constitutional challenge to succeed. And that's also the basic reasoning underlying at least 3 of the US cases dealing with similar legislation restricting entry on a misrepresentation. I would also argue that the legislation is not minimally impairing because there are other ways to achieve the legislative objective and have less of an impact on fundamental freedom. So, for example, simply raising the fines for trespassing would do the job, or expressly prohibiting the introduction of biosecurity threats like the federal private members bill C-205 would do. Both of those things would impair rights less than the current form of the legislation. And again, that's enough for the law to fail in a constitutional challenge. I would argue that there are similar things at play with respect to the transport provision, but I'm at my time, so I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our time for presentations. We'll now turn to the government side for questions. You have 8 minutes. Who would like to begin? Please raise your hand. MPP Cramp, you may begin.
Well, thank you, and welcome to all of our guests. This gives us a great opportunity to hear a broad divergence of opinion. I can certainly assure you that's just the nature of not only politics, but I guess human nature as well. Obviously, I come from a significantly engaged agricultural community, so I certainly have some strong feelings on the matter. But I've heard a lot of witnesses here so far, and I agree with some of my colleagues in that from all sides here, in which we're definitely trying to strike, as has been said, a balance. And in that balance, transparency, scrutiny, public safety, property rights, all of that do have to come into account on this. And I have participated in a roundtable, matter of fact, just a few months ago, and I've been on and around the agricultural community for many, many years, working and dealing with them. And this expression of the abuse of property rights and trespass has been non-ending. It's always been there, and quite frankly, to pull upon the comments by Ms. Andrea Jones-Bitton, this is it's really festering to a point where it's having some serious impact on some of our communities. I'm deeply concerned right now because farmers, quite frankly, particularly during this time when we do need integrity of our food supply, the pressure that they're going through, they need allies, not enemies. And I can tell you that most farmers, literally almost without exception, are great stewards of the land. They care very, very deeply. The last people that they would want to impact is the Canadian public by putting for a product that is not acceptable, not done in a humane manner, and within the basically expectations of Canadians. So obviously, I think you know my stance on this, but I've just a couple of quick questions, and I'm hoping you can provide maybe familiar, just a quick, almost yes or no. First, Ms. White, and then Ms. Lazar. How much time and experience do you have either living or working within the agricultural community itself on the land itself? Ms. White?
Yes, that's an interesting question because as an animal rights person, I often get asked that. In fact, on my mother's side, came from a farming community. My uncle was a dairy farmer. We spent a lot of time in the agricultural community, looking at, talking about, working with the animals there. My aunt used to slaughter her own animals on the farm. So I'm pretty familiar with aspects of that, and I think that's where part of my expectations about treatment of animals came, and ultimately my work to try and protect animals in these circumstances.
Would you not also agree that literally almost every farmer welcomes people on their property to be able to see what they have, what they are, and they're proud of what they do, and certainly a very, very, very would be an exception to have someone that has not handled their responsibility well. Ms. Lazar, your background on agriculture, please.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a background in agriculture. I'm not a farmer. And I have been to a number of working farms on invitation. I used to ride horses, so I have a bit of experience around large animals. But I don't claim to have that experience. I'm here as an academic. I'm here to offer you my expertise on Canadian constitutional law, and on the impacts of this bill on the fundamental freedoms of Canadians, and how, in my opinion, a constitutional challenge would unfold in a court of law.
Okay, well, thank you for your opinion, and certainly that's why every piece of legislation we have goes to serious investigative counsel within the bowels of the legal professions that are accessible to the parliamentary process too. So I guess if that's a particular case, we will have that balanced discussion as we move forward. And Ms. Andrea Jones-Bitton, what are your thoughts as far as obviously you're exposed to the agricultural community by teaching and certainly instructing. Do you have any other further background beyond that?
I am born and raised a city girl, but learned about agriculture when I went through veterinary college, and have been working with producers for about 15 years now.
Cramp is muted. Sorry, MPP Cramp, we cannot hear you. Your microphone is currently muted. Can you please unmute?
Okay, went back
There we
up
go.
on. We have you now again. Okay, where I would like to go now, of course, is we have it in place right now, the Petty Trespass Act, and quite frankly, it is just that. It is petty. I certainly served in enforcement at one particular time, and I don't know any police officer who recognizes that it is a deterrent. It's almost like going 80 in a 70 zone. It really, really means nothing. It serves as a warning. It doesn't serve as a deterrent whatsoever. Any enforcement official that I've ever dealt with said, if we need to enforce something, we actually need something that's enforceable and can actually deliver a result both in as a deterrent, but certainly as a lesson for all sides. So I'm wondering, Ms. Jones-Bitton, have you heard much as far as the challenges of trying to enforce the Petty Trespass Act?
Not specifically through my research, but I have heard it through my networking with farmers, and that it is very difficult to get a response, especially within an adequate period of time.
Any further questions on the government side? Please raise your hands. MPP Pettipies, you have the floor.
Right, thank you, Chair. I would like to talk a little bit about mental health that was brought up by Ms. Bitton. I live in an agricultural community. I'm actually just northwest of Guelph is where my riding is. We're very heavily into the agricultural industry. It's actually probably our biggest industry in my riding. With the onset of COVID, has placed an additional amount of stress not only on farmers but on everybody. as to get through this. And
Have
and
1 minute left.
okay, and one of the things that has been brought up to me is that some of our farmers are not getting very good prices for their animals right now, as it is. They are COVID virus is hitting them hard. They had to go to different ways for their employees to help with their business. And the other thing is they got to worry about people walking on their farms uninvited and scaring their children, scaring their families. And so this is a couple of things I hear constantly in my writing is this what's going on. I had a chap call me and said his wife went home one day and saw a strange car going up and down the road, and she didn't know who it was. She called him to get home because she was frightened. And it turned out that this person had nothing, didn't have an ulterior motive, but she was still frightened enough to call her husband to come home because.
Thank you very much. That concludes our time for the government side. We'll now turn to the official opposition. You will have 8 minutes. Who would like to begin? Please raise your hand. MPP Vanthof, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all three presenters for coming and presenting unique perspectives. I'd like to start with Dr. Jones-Bitton. Your research is very telling, as research should be. And since we're doing the farm credit, I was a dairy farmer for 32 years, so I know both ends of the cow. But farmers are under a lot of stress. And I think animal rights activists are, for the most part, well organized. And you actually said a couple, that in some farmers said they were goaded, provoked for response. Some farmers were getting jumpy. In this bill, there's the fines for trespassing are raised, but there's actually no other protections. So the bill lays out how to do a citizen's arrest and that reasonable force can be used. Now, given, and Member Pettypiece said the same thing about farmers' mental health, and I know as a farmer, sometimes mental health, it affects us all. When people describe themselves as getting jumpy and goaded, are you a bit worried, as I am, that citizen's arrest may not work out that well in the long run for some? Like, I hate to see the point where the first case that goes to court is actually a farmer being taken to court for assault, as opposed to the animal activists being taken to court for trespassing.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
If farmers who say that they're jumpy, they're feeling goaded, they're feeling attacked, are those farmers who are feeling that, are they in the mental condition to judge what a reasonable force is if they're goaded in a citizen's arrest?
I'm not a medical doctor, and so I'm not going to comment on anybody's mental stability. Certainly what I've heard from farmers is more fear, that they're afraid for their families, they're afraid for themselves, they're afraid for their animals. I think the idea of a citizen's arrest is somewhat absurd. If I was a farmer and had a group of people come onto my farm, am I going to feel confident enough to start a citizen's arrest? I think that's putting an absolute huge amount of pressure on farmers to respond in a way that frankly isn't their responsibility.
Thank you. And that's why I'm a bit surprised in the bill, and I brought this up in the legislature, that it actually has a step-by-step process on how to proceed. And the odd part for me is the first step in the process isn't call the police. The first step in the process is ask for their name. It's not take a picture and go to the house and be safe. And step 4 is do a citizen's arrest, either yourself or your designate. And I'm concerned because I don't see any. There's no description in the bill of how to train people for citizens arrest. No, it's citizens arrest, and I'm very, very concerned about that. I'd like to switch over now to Madame Lazar. There's two parts. This actually is two bills. In the trespassing part, which farmers like, and farmers kind of understand, except maybe not the citizens arrest part. But the whistleblower part, I'm not sure they understand, and maybe they do. But what I'm concerned about is if there is a constitutional challenge, that challenge will actually hurt the reputation of the agriculture community, because I agree with Member Kremp. The vast majority of farmers are doing things right. The vast majority of processors are doing things right. But there are bad apples in every business. And I'm worried that this constitutional challenge could impact the good name of the vast majority of agriculture. Could you comment on that, please? Through the
Yeah, hi. Yes, I agree with you completely. I mean, the research that I've done, mostly out of the United States, which has a lot of experience dealing with ag bills, where they've been struck down for very similar reasons that I'm outlining. One of the real problems is that they really do erode trust in farmers and in the agriculture industry. Absolutely. We've heard earlier today that they might do more of a disservice to farmers than a service. Members of the public will want to know what it is that farmers are hiding. And if it really is only a case of a few bad apples, then we shouldn't need this kind of legislation. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. There is social science research demonstrating that ag legislation does erode public confidence in animal farmers and in the agricultural system.
So, if this again, back to you, I would take it, and I might be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, luckily. If the ag part, basically but what you refer to as the ag part was removed, the risk of a constitutional challenge to the strengthening of the trespass side would be reduced.
Yes, Ontario is within its rights to constitutionally, in terms of the division of powers. Provinces have jurisdiction over property and civil rights, so it's up to the province to deal with trespassing. The objective of this bill is to prevent trespassing. Then preventing trespassing would achieve that objective. We heard that the Petty Trespass Act is, maybe not a deterrent. Well, there's nothing preventing the government from increasing fines through the mechanism in this bill.
You have 1 minute left.
That would be less grounds for a constitutional challenge, I'd say.
Okay.
I'll just add,
Sorry?
I just want to add that with the caveat that the provincial government is not allowed to adopt criminal legislation. So it would have to be clear that that the objective of increased trespass fines are really grounded in the protection of property and not as a condemnation of criminal activity.
Thank you very much. There are 5 seconds left. I'm assuming no further questions at this point. We're now going to turn to the Independent Green Party member, MPP Schreiner. You have 6.5 minutes. You may begin.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank all 3 presenters for being here today. It's nice to have a Griffin present as well. And I actually want to start by saying that I've heard many of the stories that Andrea Jones-Benton's testimony validates. I've heard it anecdotally from a number of farmers, I grew up on a farm, if we're talking cred. I didn't have to milk cows. I just had to deal with grass-fed beef, so and some grains as well. And I can definitely attest to the stress that many farmers face for a variety of reasons, and increasingly, those who are in animal agriculture face increased stress. But my question is actually going to go to Dr. Lazar, and it somewhat along the lines of MPP Vanthof. I'm looking at some ways that we can address the fears, the stress, the harassment, maybe the private property concerns that many farmers have that is outlined in the research that Dr. Jones-Bitton has done. Can we address that without raising the constitutional and charter concerns? And with your legal expertise, can you maybe outline some ways in which we could do that?
Sure. Well, again, I mean, I have a similar answer to the last question, which is that the government could address that by drafting a bill that explicitly addresses that, trespassing, protecting private property, without making the bill overbroad by limiting freedom of expression in a way that's not connected to the purpose of protecting property, farmers, animals, biosecurity, yeah, so the government could adopt a bill that addresses those things and only those things, and then they wouldn't be at risk of a challenge for overbreadth.
And then I just want to follow up. I thought MPP Cramp made a good point about just the fact that a lot of trespass law isn't that effective. Police don't respond. It's not much of a deterrent. So would you have some suggestions of how we could make trespass law more effective in addressing these concerns, again, without entering into the charter concerns through the potential overreach of the bill?
Yeah, I'll say, thank you. I'll say I'm not extremely fluent in the Trespass Act in terms of what the penalties are. So if maybe I'm speculating here, maybe the penalties in the Trespass Act aren't enough to have a chilling effect on trespassers. So a higher penalty, for example, might deter trespassers. Yeah, but whatever is adopted would have to be limited to actually addressing the problem being targeted.
Thank you. I'm going to shift to Dr. Jones-Bitton for a second, just to dig into your research a little bit. We've heard today from other farmers who have talked about almost feeling some levels of harassment that have nothing to do with what's happening on their private property. And you kind of hinted at that a bit in your presentation as well. So it seems like there may be some other aspects to this issue that aren't even covered by this bill that would be worth us examining moving forward. Would your research seem to indicate that?
I would say so, yes. And when I provided witness at the federal level, that is one of the recommendations that came out of that farmers are feeling as if their entire way of life is under attack. I mean, this isn't an occupation. This is a family history, a family legacy. Many of these farms go back generations. There's a real sense of personal honor and a code of ethics in caring for animals. Frankly, there's a lot of misleading anti-agriculture campaigns out there that are based on lies. There's a lot of good ones out there, but just like there might be some bad apples in the farming community, there's some bad apples in the anti-agriculture community as well. And so they're really feeling that they're under attack. I hear stories of kids now in rural areas being some of the only farm kids in the schools, and they're getting picked on. They're getting called names like murderer and animal abuser and things like that as well. So yeah, it's a big issue, this anti-agriculture bullying, either in person or cyberbullying, or these targeted attacks where the group
1
in
minute left,
Toronto.
MPP Schreiner.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah, no, I'm deeply concerned about that as well. And what really concerned me is a lot of research is showing that when constitutional challenges of ag-gag bills happen, at least in the context of the US, it's actually made that harassment even worse. And so I really appreciate you bringing that research to bear and having us think through its effects on farmers and farm families. And I know I'm probably almost out of time. Ms. White, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to ask you a question, but I just want to thank you for your presentation and particularly the issues you brought up around a duty to report for veterinarians. And you may have a few seconds if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
I just wanted to say actually that I think what this bill does is it divides everybody. And we have an opportunity to have this bill removed so that people on all sides.
Thank you
of this
very much.
issue-
That concludes your time, MPP Schreiner. We'll now turn to the government side for 8 minutes. I see MPP Barrett, your hand is raised. You may begin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And again, the social isolation, I hope I didn't trump any of my colleagues on the committee. Again, maybe I'll just continue with the first testimony. Liz White raised the issue of veterinarians and the duty to report. I'd like to direct the question to both Liz and then after that, maybe Andrea. And I was just thinking when we have committee hearings, we certainly hear from individuals, organizations, and oftentimes from professional bodies. And I don't know whether I've seen any, I'm sure stuff has come in from some of the veterinarian associations and what their position would be. What would they say with respect to duty to report? As we have so much respect for veterinarians, a very tough course. I couldn't get into OVC. I went to OAC instead, but they are there for farmers, livestock farmers. They're on the farm, they're in the barn, they're dealing with oftentimes some serious problems that a livestock person could not handle. And as a professional body, the guidelines, we talk about personal honor and code of ethics on all sides. And I'm just curious, the relevance of this debate for veterinarians and their professional work that goes back many, many years. My great-grandfather was a veterinarian, and I guess I'm not up to date on their professional guidelines or code of conduct. For example, duty to report, whether there's a law or not. What about the professional body? So, Liz, could we ask you? I think you raised that. And then I'd like to go to Andrea, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have if the bill passes, you have two competing directions to veterinarians about what they must do. Under the PAWS Act, they have a duty to report regardless. If they see some sort of inappropriate treatment of animals, they have a duty to report, and it lays out a whole specific line of things that they report, includes psychological deprivation. Then we come to Bill 156, where you're required, it seems to me from reading the act, to get permission from the owner-occupier if you decide that you saw something that needed to be reported. And so the question becomes, is there a conflict between the two pieces of legislation? And how would that be resolved should that be the case?
Could I go to Andrea, please? And I think one of my colleagues has a question as well.
And so the question is there.
I'm sorry. There's something happening with my audio. I've messaged. I'm hearing like 3 lines of voice at the same time.
Could I go to Andrea, please? And I think one of my colleagues has a question as well.
Okay, the line, I was having an issue where I heard 3 different lines of audio over top of each other. There's something happening with my audio. I've messaged. I'm hearing like 3.
You might have to put in headphones to avoid getting feedback. So I would suggest putting in headphones if you can, Andrea. In the meantime, we'll turn to MPP Pettipies. I know you had a few questions. You may begin.
Thank you. This is addressed to Andrea. How are you hearing me now, Andrea? You're not?
Is this something that we can? Yeah, it's already paused. Do you have the translation feature turned on, Andrea? Oh, we lost her. Okay, so you're still with us. You've turned off the video. Before we resume time, do you have questions for anyone else, or is it just for Andrea? Because perhaps we could. Oh, there she is. Andrea, is it better now? Can you hear us? Is everything working?
It really isn't. Should I try leaving and coming back?
You're coming in loud and clear now.
Yeah, we have no issues hearing you. Do you have questions for anyone else, or is it just for Andrea? Because perhaps we could. Are you watching the live stream? Is it open on a website, perhaps? Because there seems to be a bit of a lag. No. Okay. Perhaps you can try leaving and coming back. Okay, we'll wait for you. Thank you, everyone, for your patience while we figure out this technical difficulty. Is it working now, Andrea? Okay, we will go back to MPP Pettipies. Could you please repeat your question?
Yes. Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Yeah. I think I told you before. In fact, I know I told you before where I'm located at. And one of the things we tried to promote in our region, certainly throughout rural Ontario, is the farm tourism business. And we have quite a clientele built up of people that come from the populated the city areas to come out into our area. They go to farmers markets, they buy their meat, their vegetables, and they have built quite a repertoire with the farmers out our way. They know them by name, they know who's coming, and it's actually a great experience. Since the COVID-19 hit, that is a lot more difficult than what it used to be. So some of our farmers are, I want to get back to the mental health part. They're worried about their future over this. And whether the farmer market, the farm to consumer business is going to be as big as what they had hoped it would be. The other thing too is that if they have strange people that they don't know come to their roadside stand or come to their farm to buy their product, they're very suspicious of who those people are. And it's getting worse. And so that's giving them a lot of anxiety as to who they should allow and who they shouldn't allow on their farm. And some of these people can be legitimate people. In fact, most of them are, I'm sure. But there's still that thing in the back of your mind that you've got somebody there that wants to create some trouble. And so that's adding more stress onto our farming community. We have already had several stories about farmers that are really suffering mental issues over this, and God forbid they do something terrible. So, do you know any statistics on is there a certain percentage of people in our business that are say they have mental issues, because I know farmers don't like talking about it. They just soon keep it to themselves. And that's one of the biggest problems. So could I ask you if you've been talking to the farming community as to, is there a growing percentage of farmers that are having issues with the mental health issues? Is that growing, or is it pretty much what it was?
That's a great question. So the survey that we did back in 2015, 2016 used validated psychometric scales to assess various different mental health outcomes of Canadian farmers. So these are not diagnostic tools. You need a medical professional to make a diagnosis, but they are screening tools that can highlight an area of concern. And we did find that Canadian farmers, more of them scored in the high stress category. The depression and anxiety scores were higher, and burnout was higher than the general population norms that make up the references for those
You have 1
scales.
minute left.
And they were also higher than other occupations. So yes, absolutely, we've seen that our farmers are experiencing higher levels of mental illness than other occupations.
Okay. We've tried to get a message to our farming community that it's all right to talk about this, even though they don't want to do that. Do you have any? There's always helplines to call and whatever else, but it's very difficult for them to do this. Farmers, they have a higher accident rate than a lot of industries do, so they're always facing that. They're working with very large machinery, so a lot of these things can play into a farmer's life, and certainly the people that think they have the right to walk on your property whenever they feel like it is putting an added bunch of stress on that community. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That concludes this round of questioning for the government side. We'll now turn to the official opposition. You'll have 8 minutes. Who would like to begin? Please raise your hand. MPP Glover, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I've got a few questions. I'll start with, first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm taking extensive notes as we're here, as you're speaking. And I will say that the deputations we've had so far have been very helpful in clarifying the strengths and weaknesses of this legislation and achieving or not achieving the goals that it intends to achieve. So thank you very much for being here. Andrea, I'll ask my first question to you. In response to the ad hominem question, I had the privilege of living on a farm in my younger days for a while, and it was a great learning experience. But I'm deeply saddened to hear about locks on barns. When I was on that farm, I think there were locks on the houses, but I don't know that they were ever used. I don't remember them ever being used. And I'm also really deeply concerned, as an educator, I'm deeply concerned about harassment of children in schools. That's just appalling. And I want to ask, though, I would like to see your report on mental health of farmers. And I'm wondering also, obviously harassment, and I'm going to ask Jody a question about harassment, but what is the economic impact, or how much is economics a factor? I saw this study that showed that overall our GDP across all sectors had grown by 50% over the last 30 years, but farming incomes have remained flatlined. And I asked the OFA about it, and the OFA said, yeah, basically farmers, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but my interpretation of what they said was that, farms are being squeezed between the corporations who sell them the inputs and the corporations that buy the products. So to what degree is economics also a factor causing this mental health stress among farmers?
Financial stress was a major stressor that was identified in our research interviews. Absolutely crushing. And people seem to think that it would depend on commodity and that the supply managed commodities are better off than not. I don't have the economic data to say it's one way or another, but I can say that across the board, regardless of commodity, financial pressures were huge. And again, tied in with that is the fact that it's not even like they're working an 8-hour day, right? It's often an 18+ hour day. They've also got the family legacy of of the farm tied in with that as well. They've got multi-million dollars in debt hanging over their heads for some of them. So I would say finances were major.
Okay, great. You know what, if you could look up my office online and just send me a copy of that report, I'd like to see it. I want to ask a couple of questions of Ms. Lazar. You mentioned Trespass Act. The things that we've been hearing about seem more like harassment. Online harassment, harassment of farmers near their property, harassment of a woman this morning. One of the deputants runs a horse tour, like horse-drawn carriages through Niagara Falls, and she gets harassed all the time. What about harassment laws and those not being enforced? Do you know any, can you provide any insight into that?
I'm limited in what I can say at the level of criminal law. I do think that there are recourses in there. If something amounts to criminal behavior, then there are offenses in the criminal code. So
okay,
that's one response. I'll add as well that with respect to children, a lot of bullying and harassment takes place online, and there are certainly statutes that deal with things like cyberbullying, where children are concerned.
Okay, the other legal question I have, it sounds like if this bill is passed as is, there's gonna be a charter challenge. Could the government, they've done it once before, they used the notwithstanding clause to pass through legislation that was gonna be challenged, you know, for violating people's charter rights. Could they use the notwithstanding clause to get this through in spite of, you know, the potential challenge on, or to overcome the challenge on the freedom of speech?
So Section 33, the notwithstanding clause exists. It's not entirely clear, and there are many who would argue, I think myself included, that Section 33 does not immunize legislation from a court challenge. It allows the legislation to operate. That doesn't mean that it can't nevertheless be pronounced on by a judge. That's what's happening in Quebec with the religious neutrality law. It also expires. Section 33 needs to be renewed every 5 years. So, I mean, it can be used. Yes, I don't know that it's a solution to a court challenge.
Right. Thank you for that. And the other question I have is, somebody mentioned, I think it was Ms. White, that there was a conflict between the duty to report under pause and the duty of, you know, and this legislation and reporting, people reporting what they're seeing if they're seeing animal abuse. Can you just comment on that? Is there a conflict between those two pieces of legislation?
I'd have to take a closer look at pause, but my understanding is that while it is strong animal welfare legislation, there is an exemption in there for agricultural practices. So I'm really not sure that it would be of any use to a veterinarian or someone else who witnesses cruelty on a farm.
Okay. And the other thing that we've heard about this morning in the States, when this legislation was challenged for being against, I think it's the First Amendment in the States, the First Amendment rights, it actually raised the profile of this issue to the point where farmers were saying, you know, forget this legislation, it's actually harming our business more than it's helping. Could you foresee something like that happening here?
I mean, certainly a challenge is going to bring attention. It's going to bring media attention. You know, especially in the days of social media, people can live tweet and get everything out there immediately. So a court challenge would probably include evidence about agricultural practices that animal rights activists are opposed to, would put those on public record. It would draw a lot of attention, not just to the fact that that the legislation enables the agricultural industry to hide their practices, but also about practices themselves that not everybody agrees with. So it would certainly bring attention. Yes.
Okay. That's great. Those are all of my questions. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. There's 30 seconds left if anyone else on the official opposition, no? All right. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to thank all the presenters for coming here today. It was a very informative discussion, and I know the committee certainly appreciates your time. You are now free to leave, and at this point, we'll like to call upon our next set of witnesses.